Hello there. Today I'm taking a little bit of a risk on a wine. I've got a Pomerol open, so from the right bank in Bordeaux, but this is a 1993 Pomerol. This is from Chateau Beauregard. So why is this a risk? I mean, it's a 32-year-old wine. Surely this is going to be fantastic. The trouble being that 1993, not the best of vintages, so I'll be interested to see how this develops. Now, Chateau Beauregard is located on the east side of the Pomerol appellation, closer to Saint-Émilion. Its near neighbours include Petit-Village, Vieux, Château, Certan, La Conseillante. The property is one of the older properties in the region, having been founded by somebody called Bernard Beauregard back in 1677. That having been said, I don't think the estate produced much in the way of wine at the stage, and I think for about 100 years there was a period where it only had about a hectare of vines, so probably just producing wine for its own consumption. And actually the chateau here is quite spectacular. It's one of the few sort of real chateaus in Pomerol. In 1745 it needed rebuilding. So the current chateau was actually designed by an architect called Victor Léon, who's best known for his design of the Grand Theatre right in the middle of Bordeaux. It's quite a spectacular estate with some sort of landscape gardens at the back, and there's an effect of sort of having a moat beyond the terrace and that sort of thing. And in fact the American socialite Florence Guggenheim evidently so loved the chateau here that she had the entire thing reconstructed in replica on her Long Island estate back in the US. So it was in the 1800s that the estate became a full-scale wine producer. By the time you get to 1854, it's noted that there are 14 hectares of vines here. And in fact we see in 1935 that they sold 5 hectares of vines to Antoine Moueix. And the estate stayed in the hands of the Beauregard family right up until 1991, just 2 years before this wine was produced, when it was purchased by a bank, Credit Foncier de France, who set about investing in renovating and improving the property. They did a lot to improve the winery and also the cellars, and in 2009 they achieved organic certification for the vineyards here. And then it was in 2014 that the estate was sold to its current owners, who are a combination of the Moulin family, who have retail investments called Galeries Lafayette and Monoprix, and also the Catillard family, who own Smith Haute Lafitte, have an interest in the estate now. So currently the vineyard actually consists of 17.5 hectares, so clearly since 1935 they purchased additional vineyard, and this is divided into 35 different plots. Today the blend is a combination predominantly of Merlot and Cabernet Franc, and the planting ratio is approximately 70% Merlot to 30% Cabernet Franc. Small amounts of grape varieties that had previously been there, such as Cabernet Sauvignon and Malbec, have now been pulled out. The terroir here is a mixture of sand, clay and gravel soil, and the best terroirs are located to the north of the property, where you have more clay and gravel in the soil, and that's where you find most of the Merlot growing. And the vineyards further to the south have more sand in them. These days that tends to be where the wines that go into their second wine are sourced. So in fact the first wine probably comes off about 9 hectares of vineyard in total. One of the peculiarities about Beauregard is some actually quite high planting density. It's quite unusual in Pomerol to see densities here. They're at about 9,250 vines per hectare. That's much more usual on the Medoc and much less so on the right bank. Average vine age is now about 35 years, and as I say, since 2009 everything has been farmed organically. So as far as I can see, in 1993 the blend is 65% Merlot, 30% of Cabernet Franc, and at that stage there was still Cabernet Sauvignon in the vineyards, and so the balance, the remaining 5%, is made up of that. I'm not aware of there being Malbec in this particular blend. Now the context of the 1993 vintage is quite important. 1993 is sometimes referred to as a good vintage, generally more seen as an average sort of vintage. The point was it followed from 91 and 92, where there were dreadful problems with hail and rain, and the wines were very dilute. So compared to those two vintages, 93 was a big improvement. It still wasn't great, but it was a vintage that had initially offered a huge amount of potential. So wet spring had transferred to a warm autumn, going through to a really quite hot August, but heavy downpours in September and October really did dilute the wines. They were fortunate in that it was cool enough that actually the humidity didn't lead to a huge rot problem. For the vintage, it tends to be the right bank that has done best, and Merlot was the variety that coped best. Now, Chateau Beauregard was quite well placed in 1993. There was a lot of improvement going on in the cellars, they were working hard in the vineyards, and they opted to wait and to pick later. So there probably is more ripeness in the fruit in this wine than in some of their neighbours who'd picked earlier, but the late rain probably still leads to dilution here. And the other quality factor that occurred in 1993, evidently, was that they produced a second wine, so that a portion of the production could be declassified to make sure that just the best wines made their way into the Grand Vin. Back in 1993, vinification took place in stainless steel tanks. These days they have some beautiful modern cement fermenters, but in 1993 these were almost certainly state of the art. And they were confident enough to use an extended maceration for between 3 and 5 weeks according to the lot. So clearly the winemakers didn't see unripe characteristics in the fruit. Assuming that they followed the same practices that they do now, it's likely that the malolactic conversion would have taken place in barrel, which helps to give the wine some smoothness, and then aging in French oak barriques tends to go on here for a fairly long period, between 18 and 24 months. Now, I don't know what the regime at the time would have been, but currently they'll use 65% of new oak each year. Possibly the percentage of new oak wasn't as high as that in 1993. When I looked at the aging potential for this wine, I saw 2 notes, one of which was a retailer who was still selling it, suggested that its drinking window was up until 2023. French wine critic Jean-Marc Coirin had suggested that it was best drunk before 2013. So in honesty, I'm not quite sure what to expect. This is a wine that is potentially past its best. It's a wine that, when I looked at the winesearcher aggregated critics score, only scores 86 out of 100. So my expectations aren't high. But let's not prejudge it. Let's see what we make of it, shall we? First thing to say is, looking at the colour, there's some quite sort of garnet, sort of red to brown notes at the rim there. But it does still have a reddish core. It's certainly not opaque. Swelling it, the wine only has 12.5% alcohol, but that was much more usual for wines back in 1993. I can't see tears forming readily on the glass there, and probably that's because some of the tannins will have fallen out of suspension here. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? Gosh, the aromas are actually quite attractive. They really are very typical of a sort of really high-toned old Bordeaux wine. There are some notes there of rose petals. There's some notes of some tea, some quite high-toned notes of tea. That sort of slight spice note there. There are meaty notes. And I think underlying, as it's sort of slowly opening up, there's a mushroom note behind the whole thing. But really there's some energy, there's almost some ripeness, there's almost a sort of a hint of a raisiny note. Perhaps also some very well integrated fine notes of cedar. So let's have a taste, shall we? On the palate, there's an initial warmth and roundness. There's quite a fresh acidity runs through the whole thing that is perhaps slightly taking over. The alcohol at 12.5% is not huge, and the acidity is making it seem a little lean. There are very fine tannins. There's a lovely smooth chocolatey note. There are some delicate hints of things like rose petals. They're high tone notes. There's a touch of rhubarb perhaps. There's lively yet delicate red fruit. There are meaty and mushroom sort of notes. But actually also what's happening is that the acidity is just closing it up a little, making it quite lean. It's giving a long, fairly drying finish, where there are fine notes of sort of cedar, coffee, leading to a sort of a more meaty mushroom note on the finish. Now, I will say that I tasted this when I first opened it, and there it was much more generous and rich. And although that was only 20 minutes ago, I think some of the perfume has started to fade already. So a wine that I've enjoyed a lot more than I would have expected from a wine with a score of just 86 out of 100, but a wine whose beauty is fading really rapidly. It's been lovely to try. I think you'll find it's generally very well priced compared to other vintages, and with some justification. I mean, I'll leave a link in the notes below to the winesearcher page for this wine, and you can see what prices it's been available at in the price history. I don't know that there'll be much available. But I guess what I'm saying is don't necessarily completely write off older, lesser vintages. You can find some beauty in there, and you can find some enjoyment, but I guess you've got to be prepared for some disappointment as well. So thank you so much for joining us. I do hope you found the tasting of interest. If you have, it would be great if you pressed the like button. I'd really appreciate that. If you have any friends you think might be interested in watching it, do please pass the video on to them. I'd really appreciate your endorsement in that way. If you've got any comments, please pop them in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. So yes, thank you once again for joining me, and I do hope you'll make some time and come and join me for another tasting in the near future. Till then, bye for now.